Hello, this is a review for the third unit, the reproductive system for Biology 30. There's a lot of structures and a lot of hormones to remember in this unit. We'll go over a few of them and ask some questions. This might be a bit longer than previous reviews, but uh, as you know, there's lots to go over. So with the reproductive organs, we have two different sets, obviously, for males and females. They both have their own set of things to remember about, and they both have their own structures and hormones. For the female reproductive system, the main reproductive organs are the ovaries, and there's usually two of these, and they take turns releasing one egg every month. These ovaries are the site of egg development, and they are the site of what we call oogenesis. Oogenesis is oogenesis, is how we sometimes spell it, um, which is started when you were, if you are a female, if you do have eggs in your body, when you were really young, but paused until puberty, and then continues one at a time, usually alternating left and right, for not the rest of your life, but until uh, middle-ish age. Um, so the ovaries are where your gametes, your eggs, are produced. These are haploid cells, N of 1, not N2, not diploid. They're formed by meiosis. And they are also the site of the production of the hormones estrogen and progesterone. The ovaries themselves have a tough covering called the tunica albuginea, fibrous sac there. They have another coating, they have another layer, and the important parts that we're concerned about are the ones that work on developing the follicles. So we have these primary oocytes, these proto-eggs, these things that are almost eggs. And you've got about 1 million of these when you were born. You've had them since about you were 3 months old inside your mother's womb. And these ones are released and continue to develop one at a time past then. The ovaries are not directly connected, which is bizarre, to the rest of your reproductive system. They're kind of anchored over here, but the eggs don't go that way, even though that's where they're trying to head. They're trying to head into the uterus. That's not where they go. They take a path down the oviducts, or sometimes we call them fallopian tubes. So sometimes we call these oviducts, and sometimes we call them fallopian tubes. The eggs, when they are released, travel along that pathway, and as they go along that pathway, they may or may not meet some sperm who may or may not fertilize them, and if they are fertilized, they will implant in a wall of the uterus, and if not, then the entire uterine lining, the endometrium, will be flushed out, usually once every 28 days, although of course that varies by individual. The difference between the male and the female reproductive system is, well, there's so many differences, right? Eggs are really big cells. They are really complex cells. They are tough. They have a collection of other cells on the outside of them that you got to have to fight your way through if you're a sperm cell. Eggs are big. You can see one. If you have very good vision, you could see one with your eyes. It's one of the only human cells that are big enough for that. Sperm are about a 1/100,000th the size or mass of an egg. Men produce about 1,500 sperm every second, whereas women release one egg every month. For the male reproductive system, when we are making a sperm, we have a long tail. That tail is for locomotion. That tail is a flagellum. We have lots of mitochondria. We have a nucleus that contains half of the chromosomes, so again, made by meiosis. And at the tip, a thing called an acrosome. An acrosome is right at the tip, and it breaks open, and it has digestive enzymes to help break through this protective layer. And it usually requires a bunch of sperm to do that. Whereas the female reproductive system has the ovaries safely inside of her abdomen, the men have their testicles outside, and that's because the ideal temperature for spermatogenesis, the generation of sperm, is about 35 degrees Celsius. Your testicles can drop lower down on a hotter day, or if you're in like a warm tub or something like that to try to cool down, or if it's really cold outside, they can retract closer to your pelvis where they can stay warmer. Let's jump over to talk about the male reproductive system for a minute here. For the male reproductive system, sperm are not the only thing involved. There are also different fluids and secretions that come together in the form of semen. So the ejaculate is not just sperm, but also has other ingredients that are useful for transportation because liquids are easier to pump. To make the sperm actually start swimming, we don't want them to start swimming all the time because otherwise they would be out of energy by the time they need to do their actual fertilization. And some food, some sugar, and some chemical protection because the pH of the vaginal canal and the pH of the uterus are not ideal for the sperm. It's kind of hostile to the sperm. Only the strongest ones can make it through. In the male reproductive system, we have the seminal vesicles, and these ones are what make most of what's in ejaculate. About 70% of the volume of an ejaculate is what produced by the seminal vesicles. The prostate gland produces some more of that fluid. The prostate gland is just wrapped around your urethra below your bladder, and this helps to keep your semen liquid. We don't want it to coagulate because we want it to stay liquid so it can find the sperm can find their way into the uterus and into the fallopian tubes where they want to go. And last, we have the Cowper's gland, or sometimes called what I think is a much better name, the bulbourethral gland, because it's fun to say. And that's just below the prostate, and that helps to clear the path because we don't want urine involved. We want just semen. So once your eggs and your sperm try to get together, which is again is going to happen somewhere in here, eggs have about 1 day from when they leave the ovary to when they head toward the uterus to be fertilized. If they miss that window, then okay, we'll try again later. For the sperm, they last a similar amount of time, a couple of days, not very long. They last longer when they're stored in the male reproductive system, but they don't get stored for very long either. Millions of sperm are ejaculated each time, and about 10 of them will reach the egg or the oocyte because it's acidic in there. There's mucus layers that help to slow them down, and there are white blood cells in the uterus that see those sperm cells as foreign, which they are, and they are attacked. By the time sperm get to do the fertilization, they need to be what we call capacitated. They need to be activated. And the acrosome on the tip of the sperm has to break open, and that also helps to break through the corona radiata, which is the layer of cells around the egg, and the zona pellucida, which is a thicker coating on the outside of the egg cell itself. Once some number, maybe 1 or 2 or 5 or 10 of those sperm work on breaking through the outer protective layer, a different sperm cell comes through and can bind to the receptors on the cell membrane of the egg. So once we finally get to the cell membrane here, we've gone through here, finally we get to the cell membrane, and that will let the sperm cell break open and deposit all of its genetic material, half of those chromosomes from the male, into the egg where they can then fuse to form a zygote. So this process is, of course, more complex than what I just talked about. It always is, right? So for the female reproductive system, we're coming back here, we have menstrual cycles and ovarian cycles to keep track of. Those both start at puberty. And at puberty, the menstrual cycle is what helps to prepare the uterus for that egg. It helps to build up that layer, this layer here, in the endometrium. The coating along the inside of the endometrium needs to be thick and nutritious so that it can support a developing egg. So that is done with progesterone and estrogen levels decreasing at the beginning to slough off that old layer, and that includes any eggs that were there from the last cycle, and about 70% of fertilized eggs, because most of the time that eggs get fertilized, they don't actually implant properly, and it leaves as a regular menstruation. Around day 14, we have estrogen rising, and that's going to help that endometrium build back up. And the egg will be released around that same day, day 14 of the cycle. We're going with a 28-day cycle in this. After that, we reach the secretory phase. We've passed the proliferative phase and the menstrual phase. And at this phase, if there is no fertilization, or we think there's no fertilization, the corpus luteum will stop secreting progesterone, endometrium will start shedding, and we'll repeat the cycle again. But if there is a fertilized implanted egg, and if your body notices it, then the corpus luteum, and we'll talk about that in a minute, will increase progesterone levels. The endometrium will get thicker, more healthy, so that the implantation can occur properly, can finish its job. Your pregnancy test, if you have a pregnancy test, will detect increased HCG, human chorionic gonadotropin levels. And those are produced later by the placenta, but initially they're produced by, well, the placenta isn't there yet, right? They're produced by the corpus luteum. The ovarian cycle is, of course, related to the menstrual cycle, but it's separate. The ovarian cycle is all about the egg, and the menstrual cycle is all about the uterus. So the ovarian cycle is about maturing that follicle and the egg. So we have, I'm just going to move over to the side here a little bit. That little scroll wheel never shows up when I want it to. Okay, we have the ovary, and in the ovary, this is by day. This is starting at the beginning of the cycle towards the end of the cycle. At day 14, so this is about day 13 here, about day 14 is when we would have an egg leaving the ovary. So for the ovarian cycle, we have first something that's starting to grow and starting to develop. We have sort of a bubble forming around it, and eventually that bubble pops, and it's like exocytosis, but at a bigger scale. And this, what's left behind is called the corpus luteum, and that helps to keep things going, keep the hormonal levels where they need to be. And the egg will leave one per month. This whole cycle takes a really long time. It takes more than a year, but only one will be released, usually per month. Sometimes people release more than one egg per month. There's a condition called hyperovulation, where people release 3 or 4 every month. I think the world record is something like 44 children or something from a woman who had this condition. She had all kinds of triplets and quadruplets. The regular amount, though, is 1 per month. So first, we have these developing follicles called primordial follicles, and halfway through to day 14, the egg will be released, and by the time we get to day 28, we just have this leftover corpus luteum here. So the changes that we see are that we can see the primary follicle developing into the secondary follicle, and then we eventually have the ovulation. Ovulation is the release of the egg into the fallopian tubes, or the oviducts. 2 words for the same thing. Once that happens, once the egg leaves, it needs to go towards the uterus, but the uterus is a long way away. It's at the other end of those fallopian tubes. So they don't always make it in time, things don't always work, and sometimes the fallopian tubes are damaged. We'll talk about that towards the end of this video. Or maybe I'll make a second video with questions like that. So the leftovers from what was wrapped around that egg cell, this is now going from beginning to end this cycle, become the corpus luteum, and that's either going to stick around and help to keep your hormonal levels where they need to be, or it's going to degenerate or break down so that there's room for a new cycle to begin. The whole cycle here is something that is definitely worth your time as you are struggling through your studies, because it is complex and it is dependent on lots of different hormones, like gonadotropin releasing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone. We have estrogen and progesterone. We have follicle stimulating hormone again. We have luteinizing hormone. And all of these things, different levels of progesterone and estrogen, etc., are all going to be important for whether this ovarian cycle continues normally or not, and they're going to change whether there's a pregnancy or not. These types of diagrams are definitely ones to either pause the video on or go into your notes about and study as well as you can. If you do have a pregnancy, if you do have a fertilization, then your progesterone levels will stay up. So will estrogen levels too. Normally, progesterone is going to peak just after ovulation and then drop back down. But in the event of pregnancy, you'll have that level rise and stay up. And that will prevent menstruation and also prevent the uterus from contracting, which is going to keep it from removing the uterine lining. So when we're looking at these cycles, it's important to focus on, of course, structures, but also to focus on hormones. So if we're looking for here we're looking at the female reproductive system hormonal levels. We have, of course, the hypothalamus, which is going to be, as you remember from last unit, in charge of everything. It's going to have a releasing hormone, and that releasing hormone will be gonadotropin releasing hormone. And that's going to go to the anterior pituitary, which is going to stimulate the release of FSH and LH, both of these hormones you remember from last unit. FSH will cause the follicle to grow. Luteinizing hormone will cause the corpus luteum to grow. The follicle growing will produce more estrogen. The corpus luteum growing will produce more progesterone. Now, I've color-coded here with blue and red. The blue is stimulating, so if there is releasing hormone, then the anterior pituitary will release LH and FSH. And that will cause the corpus luteum and the growing follicle to do their thing. But the growing follicle and the growing corpus luteum will also release those hormones, progesterone and estrogen, which will decrease, which will inhibit the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus from keeping this cycle going. So how is one of these inhibited? How is this releasing hormone inhibited? Oh, well, estrogen could do that job, or progesterone could do that job. Or how is luteinizing hormone stimulated? Oh, GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone, is going to do that job. These are questions you can ask yourselves in a diagram like this. Which hormone causes which other hormone to be released or not be released? If we do have a developing embryo, of course, there are many different phases that we don't really go over too well in Biology 30, but it's fascinating. And we know that we have these different things that are going on in the uterus. So we have an implanted egg that develops into a zygote, and that splits into a morula and splits into bigger and bigger structures. And eventually we get an embryo that has an umbilical cord, and the umbilical cord is there to bring blood, right? From the placenta to the embryo. We have the placenta, which is a whole brand new organ that you grow just for pregnancy in coordination, in combination with your embryo that's in your uterus. You grow a whole new organ. I'll never grow a new organ in my whole life. But the placenta is there to be a site for the exchange of nutrients like oxygen, get rid of the CO2, get rid of waste, bring in sugar. All that stuff is important. But it is a lot like the glomerulus in your kidney. Small things can go across, but big things cannot. There's even a yolk sac, which we don't really use. But if we were chickens, we would. But, we have common ancestors, so we still develop the same things in there. And around the embryo, we have the amniotic sac, and around that we have a bigger, tougher chorion. And the chorion isn't really in this picture, but bigger, tougher, protective layer for that developing embryo. As far as structures go, in the female reproductive system, we have, of course, the vaginal canal leading to the cervix. The cervix leads towards the uterus. This is the path that sperm would take, and they would go either up here or up here. Actually, they would go both directions because they don't know where they're headed. They just want to go towards where they think an egg is. And through the fallopian tubes, we have the ovaries. For the uterus itself, we have the myometrium, which is what causes contractions. Myo means muscle. And we have the endometrium, which is the inner part. That's where the egg will implant. For the male reproductive structures, we have the testes. And the testes are the site of sperm production. They're also the site of testosterone production. Inside of the testicles, we have things called seminiferous tubules. And the seminiferous tubules have cells called Sertoli cells, and those are going to help those along with spermatogonia, are going to help to produce sperm. Sperm take a while to be created. We're working on millions of them at a time, though, so that's all right. And once that happens, once they're almost ready to go, the sperm will then leave and head towards here, the epididymis, which isn't labeled in here. Epididymis. Come on. And they will finish their maturation there, and then they'll head down this long tube called the vas deferens. And the vas deferens, sometimes called vasa deferentia, is just a tube very much like the fallopian tube. From there, they'll go past the, well, seminal vesicles. They'll go past the prostate. They'll go past the bulbourethral gland, which will all add a whole bunch of volume to that ejaculate. So here we just have sperm, 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 and now we have a whole bunch of fluid, other fluids being added in that all have their own jobs, right? To keep the pH right, to feed the sperm, to protect them. We have the penis that they travel through. This is common territory now for urine and for ejaculate, whereas in females the vagina is for reproductive purposes, but not for urination. The structures are things to remember. They're easy to draw out, I think, and I do recommend you study that. One other thing to remember about is primary versus secondary sex characteristics. In primary sex characteristics, these are things involved like in reproduction. So, ovaries, uterus, testicles. These things are necessary for reproduction. Secondary sex characteristics are things that come about at puberty. So when we have increased estrogen or testosterone levels at at puberty, then we have, for men, we would have the larynx getting bigger and deeper and the voice deepening. For men, too, we would have increased facial hair and body hair. For men, we would have increase of muscle. For women, we would have development of breast tissue and also some increase of body hair. And these are not necessary for reproduction, but they are just common indicators of who is male and who is female. Now, I'm going to stop this video and start a new one to ask some questions about when things go wrong, because I see we're already at 22 minutes. Okay, I hope this hasn't lost you completely, and I'll be back with another video in a minute.